Rick, maybe let me pick up. This course is interesting for me. It's difficult for me because I usually go 10 or 15 hours a day dealing with contemporary events in politics, and it's hard for me to disassociate what happened in the 60s from what's happening today. In fact, before I came here this evening, had a meeting in my office with people involved in the Burlington Peace Movement, talking about tactics. How do we build a movement? How do we deal with Nicaragua, which is in many ways Vietnam, except it's worse and it's more gross. So it's hard for me. It's going to be enjoyable because it allows me an opportunity to do something that I often don't have the time to do, and that is to reflect a little bit. But I'm probably not going to do it as well as I should be able to because I am caught up very much in the day-to-day activity, and it's difficult. But let me start off by saying, as I reflect, one of the events that stands out in my life is I spent 1 year at Brooklyn College. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, went to public high school there. Then I went to the University of Chicago. And a thing that I remember very deeply, I became involved in the civil rights movement. And we had a sit-in demonstration to protest racial discrimination in Chicago. The university itself was and is a major landowner in the city of Chicago. In fact, it's one of the wealthiest institutions in the city of Chicago. You have the Catholic Church, the university, and so forth. And the university owned massive amounts of property worth hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And it turned out what we had done is we had a biracial group of people. We had white young people going into an apartment house that was owned by the university and would say, I'm interested in getting an apartment. And I said, well, fill out the forms and I'll come back tomorrow. And we had some black friends going in and they said, sorry, we have no vacancies here. And we learned, students themselves learned that the university was owning a segregated property. And this, of course, the University of Vermont, University of Chicago was one of the great institutions in America and also one of the quote-unquote liberal institutions. And to make a very long story short, the students became mobilized and there was a sit-in demonstration. And what I remember probably most profoundly was we had meetings with the president of the university then, who had been a Nobel Prize winner and so forth, very distinguished, wonderful gentleman, and he lied cold right to our face, dead lied. And it was rather shocking. It was rather shocking, and I'd say that was an important event in my life. We were dealing with all these important, impressive, wonderful people, and they lied. And that was very startling to me, and it made me begin on a personal level to begin to understand a little bit about what the world was about. Rick mentions John F. Kennedy and so forth. My reaction was different. At this point, why one becomes the way we become, or you become who you are, or I become who I am, or Rick, God only knows. We don't know, really. The thousand forces, our parents, the early upbringing, to make us who we are. But I always had a rebellious streak in me, which was not manifested in political activity. I knew nothing about politics, and my parents were not political. My brother was a little bit, not much. But I remember, for some reason or other, being very excited when Fidel Castro made the revolution in Cuba. And I was a kid, and I remember reading that. And it was just seemed right and appropriate that poor people were rising up against rather ugly rich people. And I remember, again, very distinctly, a very distinct feeling. I was watching the debates. You remember the famous Nixon-Kennedy debates. That was the first time the presidential candidates actually debated. And I was becoming increasingly interested in politics. Didn't know much, but was interested. I remember sitting in the student lounge at our dormitory watching the debate. And at that time, well, we can talk about Cuba now, I was very excited and impressed by the Cuban Revolution. And there was Kennedy and Nixon talking about which particular method they should use about destroying the revolution. And I remember the irony, as we learned the history later on, Kennedy was saying that Nixon was too soft on communism. Let me pick up a point that Rick was making. In Cuba, we should deal firmly with Fidel Castro. And Nixon was playing the role of, hey, you got to be patient. You know, you can't do these things. You got to negotiate. Well, of course, what he was upset about is that secretly they were planning the Bay of Pigs invasion right then. But for security reasons, he couldn't come out and say, we are already planning the destruction of the Cuban Revolution. Don't worry about it. So he was the liberal, and Kennedy was playing the conservative. And actually, you know, when you read novels, people say there's a sick feeling in your stomach. Usually I'm sufficiently unemotional not to be sick, but I actually got up from the room and almost left to puke. Because for the first time in my adult life, what I was seeing is the Democrats and the Republicans, both of them, and of course, as Rick points out, Kennedy was the flashing young liberal. And what we were seeing right before my eyes, way, way back then, and I didn't know anything about politics, but clearly that there really wasn't a whole lot of difference between the two. The 60s, for me, was a period, I think to understand the 60s, you have to understand the racial situation in the country at that time. In the South, you know, at that time, or some 10 years earlier, at that time, you had racial segregation. I know, as Rick indicated, it's hard to believe. But when we were kids in the South, it was in the newspapers every day, this is white only, this is black only. In Alabama and Mississippi, you had black people sitting at the back of the buses. You had kids getting absolutely inferior educations. You had vestiges of slavery. And I remember on a personal level, the idea, now one sees a black and white couple, a guy or a woman, no one really blinks much of an eye now. But in that time, even in cities like New York City, which had certainly large multiracial populations, it was an astounding sight to see a black and white person holding hands. People really couldn't believe it. It was really just absolutely startling, hard to believe. And for me, one of the important things about the 60s and being in Chicago was the first opportunity that I had in my life to work with black people and to understand and work together. And I think one of the things that I saw being at the University of Chicago, which was and is, certainly a very highly regarded university, much higher, say, on the level of supposedly good universities than UVM, is the basic hypocrisy of most of what was going on. I can say without blinking an eye that I learned infinitely more in the streets and in the community than I did in the classrooms. The classrooms were extremely boring. And I remember one incident that comes out in my mind. It strikes me. I'll never forget it. We were involved in the real world, in dealing with civil rights and so forth. And at that time, and became later very apparent, and I'm sure Rick and I will get into this later, in 1968, as some of you may recall if you read history, and it's in that anthology that you have, there was the Democrats held a convention in 1968 and elected Hubert Humphrey for president. They were rioting in the streets and so forth and so on. And the Chicago police were exposed at that point as being extremely brutal. Well, I learned that actually some years before. There were demonstrations, and I remember dealing with segregated schools. The schools in Chicago were segregated. The neighborhoods were very rigidly segregated. And there were demonstrations, blacks and whites working together. And I will never forget, there was a picture in the Chicago Defender, which was, and I suspect still is, a black newspaper of Chicago. And there was a photograph on the front page of a white policeman twisting the arm of a young black girl behind the back. It was a very effective photograph, and somebody had cut this out, put it on a poster. We were holding a meeting to protest police brutality in Chicago. And I remember walking down 57th Street in Chicago, walking away and tacking up these posters, come to a meeting, protest police brutality, and I'm walking down the street, protest police brutality, put it up. Little did I know there's a police car following me down the street. The cops have taken down the posters, Finally, I come to the corner. The guy says, "Are these your posters?" And I said, "Yes." And he says, "The problem with the city is outside agitators like yourself. If you people weren't doing this, the city would be, da-da-da." I was very frightened, needless to say, very frightened. And then I had to leave because I had to race upstairs to go to my political science class. And I sat in the back of the room there thinking about the tremendous, the lack of reality. Here I had just dealt with something that was very real. I was out on the street dealing with the policemen about a situation regarding racial segregation that was taking place 3 blocks from where this class was going. And the teacher's talking away, and it was like a million miles away. We'd raise a hand, some of us would care. Well, what about what's going on now? And the answers you'd get, they'd bore you. And you say, this is what's going on outside my window, and this is what's going on inside the classroom. And by and large, that was true with very few exceptions. And now I'm talking about what was then and probably is today one of the better universities in America. There were a few teachers who had openness and compassion. I remember a fellow who had left Nazi Germany, a very, very decent guy. But by and large, most of what we were hearing in class was not relevant to what we were feeling and seeing out on the streets and out in reality. And I could say without the slightest doubt, I learned far, far more outside of the streets. Now, also what happened is the university and I had a difference of opinion, not a difference of opinion, regarding my academics. I was not doing very well, and the dean suggested that maybe I take a little bit of time off to think about whether or not I was going to continue going to the school. So I sat down, and it was amazing. What I ended up doing is I guess I was out for a semester, and I buried myself. I was working, but I buried myself down in the basement of the library. They had a very, very fine library, which probably dubbed as a bomb shelter. Speaking of bomb shelters, a massive building, and you go miles down into the you have to fight your way into the stacks. They weren't open. You had to sneak in. It's remarkable to sneak in to read books. It was at a university, but you slip in and then you'd bury yourself down there for days. And I would do an enormous amount of reading. And in fact, I certainly learned more in that semester, and I read far more. I didn't have to worry about school, so I could read and think. And basically, I would read books that started to address some of the concerns that I had. And some of the concerns that you had is what you understand and what you saw about you, what you began to evolve. And this is very personal, didn't go for everybody. But the relationship between the real world that you saw and what you felt to be true, and the inability of, say, the academics and the professors to deal with the real world. Why are things happening? Well, the president made a wrong decision. Presidents don't make wrong decisions. Basically, if you understand, and you know, in this process, and I don't want to give you my views, I want to talk about how these things evolved. And you read about the Russian Revolution, you read about Cuba, then you read and you understand, and then you say, what's going on? How is this being reflected in the world that I'm living? For example, right now, if you want to understand what goes on in the United States, just use, and we can use 50 examples, you use Nicaragua. You will learn more. You don't have to go to Nicaragua. You don't have to read the good books in Nicaragua. If you want to understand what's going on in America today, you read the New York Times. And you read the New York Times and you understand why they are not talking about what's going on in Nicaragua. Okay? That's the important story. The important story is not Nicaragua. It's not the United States government attitude toward Nicaragua, which is no different than it's been in 50 years. The United States has the right to destroy any government in Latin America that they want, and that's been consistent for 50 or 100 years. There's nothing new about that. What is new is why, when you read the New York Times, the real truth is not being told and how that's obfuscated. Okay, that's what the interesting story. So if you want to read what goes on, and you want to know, and I was doing that. I remember reading and beginning to read about the Cuban Revolution, and what I was more impressed about is how it was being reported in the United States press. And I began to understand that you don't always hear all of the truth, that there are a lot of lies that are going on in society. Okay? And that was, to me, a tremendous opening, reading voluminously, as a matter of fact, at that time. The 60s, and one doesn't know. One can't look back on the 60s. The history hasn't been written. One doesn't know. It was in many ways a period of exhilaration, I think, and a period of a lot of pain. What began to happen is a lot of the barriers began to fall down, and people really began to ask hard questions. What is human life? I mean, what Rick was talking about is in the 50s and in the 70s, it's pretty easy. You go out, you go to school, the teacher tells you something, you write it down assiduously, you take the exam, okay, you go out, you get a job, you get married, you do all, it's pretty easy. It's not that hard. It's nice to have a structured existence. And that's pretty much what the 50s were about. And in many ways, that's nice and easy. If somebody tells you how to begin and how to end, it's pretty easy. But the 60s, in every area, and one led to another, was a busting off. And some of it very, very painful and very crazy. I remember one time, just as an example of that, a friend of mine, a guy I knew, actually, a neighbor when I was living in New York for a while, who was, between you and me, not the most sane human being in the world. The guy he was playing a flute or a harp. He was playing away, and it was terrible. I said, God, can't you play anything? He says, this is real music. It's real, I'm expressing myself. You know, it's terrible stuff. But it was the feeling, what's the difference between a Beethoven concerto and what he was doing? It's music, you know, it's expression. And, you know, I think he was wrong, but there was a feeling that we didn't quite know. One was rejecting an old standards, old values were being smashed asunder, and people didn't quite know how to develop new standards. And of course, there's always that search for new standards, but it took place at a frenetic pace. You had, certainly in the student movement, what young people were saying, and it developed more strongly after I left college. But people were saying, it's crap, I don't want to learn what you're teaching me. Okay? This place is a dump. And many painful decisions that students had to make. Basically, I remember this, and in the beginning of the 60s was more conservative than the mid and end 60s. Sitting there and saying, why? What am I sitting here taking notes for? This is stupid. You know? Do I really have to suffer through all of this to get the degree, or should I go out and do something that's meaningful now? And people were really, many people picked up and left school. Okay? People started what they called free universities all over the place. Many institutions, you had the university. You might have a place, you know, with the University of Minnesota and the Free University of Minnesota down the street. And in fact, the more exciting, important courses were being taught at the Free University, where the faculty, sometimes faculty who had been thrown out of the regular universities, were teaching what they felt was a lot more honest material than was the conventional university. And battles. I mean, here at the university, there was a lot of friction between the Board of Trustees regarding South Africa and the students. In the 60s, that was going on in all areas. I remember myself, I have to modestly admit, writing an article for the student newspaper at the University of Chicago. And it was called, "What is the Function of the University?" That was the article. What is the function of the university? What's its purpose? What are we here? Who runs the universities? What are we being educated for? And then I did one on sexual freedom, which got a lot more publicity, actually. And they picked it up in a national newspaper. It ended up in New York City, and my uncle was very upset at me, seeing my name in the paper associated with that. But there was, in many respects, it was a time of breaking down barriers very rapidly and of asking very fundamental questions. And I think there was also, in that process, a lot of destructiveness and a lot of, as one looks back, a lot of stupidity. I remember, now as it happens, for whatever reason, I'm an enormously stubborn person and amazingly individualistic, which my friends and opponents criticized me for correctly. And it was a period, I remember once going to a party in a room, probably as many people as here, a large room, and people mulling about, and everyone was acting kind of strange. And I found out that I was the only one in the room at that time who was not on LSD. The only person in the entire room who was not on acid. And I think the drug thing was, I was not then and am not now sympathetic to drugs for a lot of reasons. But there was, I mean, certainly if you're going to look at the 60s, one can't look at it without the whole drug aspect. The music of the times was an explosion out of the past. The issue of sexuality, tremendous changes in people's attitude than had been the case in the past. And certainly, as Rick talked about a lot, the whole war movement. And for the first time, something was happening, maybe the first time in American history, is that large numbers of people were beginning to challenge a war. Now, when I was a kid, and especially after World War II, which, 99.9% of the people in America had felt was a proper war, fighting against Nazism, fascism. And the sense, it was a shock to everybody, I think, that large numbers of people were beginning, that it was not enough for the President of the United States to get up now and say, we are fighting for freedom in Vietnam. And usually everybody always believed those things, but now you had people, starting with small numbers of people, starting with students, beginning to question them. And the demonstrations would go larger and larger, 5,000, 10,000, 100,000. And more people would come in, and the kids would come home in body bags. And people were wondering, My Lai, remember what My Lai was about? American soldiers were accused of massacring Vietnamese people, okay, and burning of villages. Okay, and people began to say, is this the United States of America? And the country became extraordinarily bitterly divided. And finally, as the movement filtered down more into middle America, as they saw their kids coming home in body bags, and as they saw the lies of the presidents being exposed, okay, that war broke. But that in itself was an extraordinary time where people were challenging an American war. People were saying, you're a traitor. You're a traitor to your country. America is at war and you're opposed to it. You're aiding and abetting the enemies of your country. That is pretty heavy stuff, because in fact nobody wants to be a traitor to their country. And that you're having a nation with people, young men, and then you had a tremendous class division here. As is always the case, it's poor people who go to war. Working class kids go to war and get killed. And the college students were the ones who were demonstrating, and tremendous tension. The black kids were the ones who were getting killed. Okay. And as one reflects about the period, and one can see the tremendous tension there, and gradually more and more people, where there had been few, there were more. And finally the writing was on the wall that the American people did not want that war, and the war finally ended. And during this period, you're seeing people, young people again, and of course if one talks about the 60s, and one understands that it was a very youthful revolution, certainly, and one sees young people looking for alternative ways of living, for example. The whole idea of the nuclear family, mommy, daddy, and kids, and that's what life is about, and there was questioning of that. And in fact, the radical questioning was going deeper than had ever gone before in the country's history. There had been a time, as many of you know if you read American history, that goes back from when, where you had a strong socialist movement, you had a communist movement, you had active trade union movement. And basically those issues were pretty clear-cut. What workers were fighting for in the 20s and the 30s, even before that, is basically the right to live with dignity, the right to earn a decent wage, the right to have a union. That's what the fight was. It was pretty simple. It was basically an economic fight. But what happened in the 60s is, while the economic issue was there, and people were talking about the poverty in the ghettos, problems all over the country, the revolution expanded and became a cultural revolution. There was the understanding that perhaps the normal fabric of American life was also needing to be corrected. Not just economic inequality, but the way, in fact, we were living. And you saw movements like the commune movement, where people, in fact, tried to emulate things like the kibbutzim in Israel. And in Vermont, probably at a certain period in the 60s, I would say, in Vermont right here, there were probably a dozen communes, land which was sometimes, depending on particular situations, communally owned. People were trying to farm it, trying to raise kids in a communal way, experiments with new ways of living. You saw explosions in almost every area of academic life. Right now, we're in a conservative period. Academics are basically very conservative. But at that point, for example, in the whole area of psychiatry, I know Rick is of course, a psychologist, there was a new movement called radical therapy. All right, questioning, for example, the whole definition of mental illness. Who in God's name is mentally ill? Is it not mentally ill to go off in a stupid war and kill somebody and get yourself killed? And there are people, so the whole issue of even sanity versus insanity. And that got kind of mixed up because you had some really crazy people like Charlie Manson and his friend were posing as love human beings while they're going out murdering people. And there was, needless to say, a little bit of confusion in that. So you had also a lot of very heavy politics going on. You had revolution in the air, but it wasn't just revolution, it was cultural revolution. And you had in city after city very horrendous battles between young people and police, very bitter struggles. And you had, I think, as I reflect, and constantly what one is thinking about, what's the relationship of the 60s to what's happening right now? And certainly one of the things that one understands, I think, and it's a point that I'll probably talk about more later, is the relationship between young people and the issues that they talked about and moderate income people and working people. Very important issue, which we can get into at some other period. Because after all is said and done, what we should remember that out of the 60s, Richard Nixon was elected president in 1968. He won a landslide in 1972. And despite the fact that he was involved in Watergate and almost went to jail, the Republican Party came within a hair of winning in 1976. And some of you may know who's president of the United States today. And what is the relationship between all of that activity that I'm talking about over here and the reality of what has happened here? Who was involved? All of these things that I'm talking about. How did it affect the average man and woman who were not involved in this process? And if you talk about the need to make social change, how do you do it politically? What is the relationship between radical activity and working people and elderly people? And I think certainly one of the problems that has gone on for many years in the left movement today is that there has been that separation. Okay. Now also during this period, phenomenal things were happening around the world, not only in the United States of America. Some of you may or may not know that in '68, I think it was, there was almost a revolution in France. Not just a word revolution. Boy, it was revolutionary. There was almost an overthrow of the French government. Charles de Gaulle, who was president at the time, was busy running around to Germany and other NATO countries in order to make sure he had the troops to put down what they expected to be a revolution in France. That workers and students were working together by the hundreds and thousands and millions who were prepared to make demands on the French government which actively would have made the overthrow of the French government quite a possibility. Okay. I haven't yet, put together in my own mind what comes out of the 60s. I mean, what's left, what was important, what was good, what was not good. I think one of the things that one sees as one gets old and we get old is you look back and you see sometimes the superficiality of it and sometimes not. You see people who I can remember, guys whose hairs were down to their backside. They were just ever so radical, my goodness. Nothing was too radical for them, who are now conservative lawyers, conservative business people. And you understand that for many people, things happen in a faddish type way. Everybody's doing it, why not me? I'll become a revolutionary this week too. It's the in thing to be. Okay? And certainly there was a lot of that. On the other hand, I think what you also can see now is that people who lived through the 60s in many ways learned a great deal about the world that they live in, developed a very strong sense of commitment, which many people have kept for many, many years. And it manifests itself all over the country today. Okay, maybe I'll stop at that point and maybe accept some questions and go off of that. Don't be shy. Yeah.
You entirely dropped the theme of fear of the bomb and that sort of response to fear to come related to the bomb. Do you think that figures in as strongly as...
Oh, sure. Sure it does. I mean, it would take us 100 hours, and I don't know that Rick and I combined can explain all of the phenomena. Certainly what is a new phenomena. It's a new phenomena that we are the only people for the last 40 years in history who have had to deal with it, and our children have had to deal with it. Kids have nightmares. There is out there the likelihood that in an hour you could be dead. That's all. And for 40 years, or especially since they've developed the more sophisticated weapons and the carrying systems, all of us share throughout the entire world the understanding that for no particular reason that you can understand, either by accident or because Ron is in a bad mood tonight or whatever the hell's going on, or the Russians, are doing something, that you can be dead. Okay? And obviously that reality is there. It's here with every single person in this room. You don't have to talk about it ever. You don't have to talk to children about it. They all understand that there are weapons in this world which can destroy us all. And that, of course, happened after the explosion in '45 and has continued going. It's there. And I think, how is that related to the 60s? How is it related? I think it's obviously, it's there. It's present all the time. The understanding that I think people in the 60s felt and feel today, the insanity of it all. The insanity of it all. That people have not yet learned, after thousands of years of killing each other, that that's maybe a stupid thing to do. And when you watch, again, I'm older than you, and I probably know more about these things than most of you, and I watch Reagan on television. I could write you the script in 5 minutes. It's an old script. He got it from some old movie that he was probably in. It's the same speeches they've been giving for about 100 years. These are the terrible bad guys. They are, and you list off all of these things. They're drug dealers, they're anti-Semitic, they're communists, they're totalitarian, all this whole list of things. It doesn't have much to do with reality. And we, of course, are the good guys, and they're the bad guys, and we're going to fight for God and freedom, and they're the evil, da-da-da-da-da. I mean, they wrote the same speech, they gave the speech, go through the history books, the same speech, both countries. The other side gives the same speech, too. And, at a certain point, you look back and you say, God, why? And you sit back. And I think Vietnam was something like that. People could not get swept into it. The establishment was a little bit surprised. The way it had always been is, okay, boys and girls, there's a war. Let's go. They're the bad guys. You're supposed to kill them. Come on, they're supposed to kill you. And we're fighting for God and country. And everybody is fighting for God and country. And then at a certain point, to everybody's surprise, people say, oh, wait a second. Wait a second. How do we get involved in this? Well, we're not so sure we're on the right side. And in fact, although many of us get depressed about what's going on in Nicaragua today and the absolute lies that are coming out of the White House, in fact, we have a right to be very exhilarated. That today, despite years and years and years of lies on the part of the media and the president, still the American people, 60, 70% of the people are still not buying it. Now, certainly, if you think back to Vietnam in the beginning when they started this whole business, there were a handful of people. They do polls. 90% of the people think the United States should be in Vietnam. And it took years. Okay? And remember, no American kid has come back from Nicaragua yet in a body bag. And still 70% of the people are against the war. And that's why Reagan is not sending the American kids there, paying for the poor Nicaraguans to kill each other. Okay? Because and that's pretty impressive. And that, I think, is a good thing. So to get back, to answer your questions, it's there. It has been there since 1945. And I think, I think that is a fact. But people are looking when they say, look, this is what's normal. This is what's good. What you people have given us is a world where you can kill each other. We don't accept that as a normal value. We think that's pretty crazy and that's pretty stupid. Okay? Everything you tell us leads to the fact that we are spending billions of dollars on weaponry that can kill the whole world. We're beginning to challenge some of your assumptions. Don't tell us that if we go A, B, and C, and D, this is all right, because you've led us to some pretty stupid conclusions. And we're going to begin to challenge that whole assumption.
I have a comment on your question as well. I think that during one period, the early part of the 60s, there was a real movement that started around the bomb shelter thing and the whole civil defense movement that was gaining a little bit of steam. It was gaining a little bit of steam. And what I think distracted America and Americans from that quite quickly was the incursion into Vietnam. Because everybody, remember, the largest group of young Americans living in history were also living at that point, the baby boomers, okay? Bernie's my age and kids somewhat younger than us, all of whom were war eligible, okay? The largest group of young Americans ever to exist, almost outweighing the ones that were older than them in terms of numbers. And I think what happened was that this caught, even though it was slow, as Bernie said, 63, 64, it caught the nation so much that people were temporarily distracted from the nuclear fear, okay? Every night, Walter Cronkite, every night talked about the body count. And I'll tell you, after about 1 year, I couldn't turn on television. I could not look at it. I could not think about it. I would get on an airplane and, stick a radio thing in my ear and listen. I couldn't listen to it because every day it was a body count. So I think one thing that went on during that early period is the media shifted its attention. And once a year, President, Congress, budget, bang, Russians are there, let's keep building it up. No one paid any attention. We paid our taxes, we did our thing. But all the focus was on that one little country during that period. So people forgot temporarily about it. They were yelling about peace, but they were yelling about stopping killing our boys.
So I think if one also, just to take a little tangent, if one thinks about the 60s, and I say, well, what would be the significant thing about the 60s? Probably if one understands that today, I'll give you an example. As you know, in elections, about half the people vote in America. Most of the people don't vote in local elections. Often you have a lot less than that voting. The truth of the matter is most people are not active, politically active. Most people, depending on the area and the time, the vast majority of people are not active in trying to shape the social environment that they're living in. It's always a small numbers of people. What happened in the 60s, all over the place, is that people themselves became far more involved. Instead of sitting and allowing other people to make decisions for them, they began to get up. And you saw that all over the place. Certainly, for many, many years, there had always been a black movement, a civil rights movement. For many years it was conservative, middle class, NAACP. And then what happened is the movement spread to the young people, and in the area of the black Muslims, and Malcolm X and so forth, it spread to the ghettos. Black people who had been oppressed for many, many years were afraid to stand up, now stood up with a rage. Okay? And women in the same way, who had felt many oppression in a variety of ways for many, many years, they began to stand up. And students who had felt academic oppression, if you like. I was reading just briefly in the anthology you have. There's a wonderful thing, a fellow named Mario Savio. You remember Mario Savio? Out at the University of California at Berkeley. And what you had there at Berkeley, you have a tremendous, 30, 40,000 students out there, 20,000, I don't know, it's like a factory. And what he said is, it is a factory. We are being, as students, being treated like factory products. No one cares about what we feel. No one cares about what we want to learn, what our aspirations. The teachers are not telling us what we want to know. They're not working with us. We're little slots in the machine. And of course, the students themselves began to demand changes in the university, and then that started a whole student movement. But all over the place, more and more people were making demands upon the system. And that was probably the most important and exciting aspect of that period. Because if one believes in democracy, basically the most important thing you're believing in is the right of people to control their own lives, the right of people to participate in the process. The whole word, participatory process, came out of that. How do we make decisions? Well, I'm the leader and you're the follower, so I'll tell you what to do. Well, people say, no, that's not the way we want to do it. We want democratic participation. Okay? And people were talking about, well, maybe that should take place not only in academia, maybe we should actually give some of the faculty and students some decision-making. Maybe it should take place in the workforce as well. Maybe we should begin to challenge a system where the boss makes all the decisions and the worker does all the work. Okay? But what I would say was the exciting aspect of that period is all over the place. People were beginning to stand up and say, hey, we want some control over our lives. Yes?
Could you say that, okay, when you're talking about the media shifting its attention from the A bomb, H bomb into that one of the reasons primarily that the ship was into Vietnam also was like in association with Kennedy's assassination? I mean, was that a direct reason, would you think, to why we got more particularly involved in Vietnam? Was Kennedy's assassination too, or?
I mean, as Rick, I am not a historian. I don't really know the answer to that. What I think is, I mean, it's not really. The issue of Vietnam is very similar to the issue of Nicaragua. And if you follow what goes on in Nicaragua, remember those Blackwoods of the domino theory. And what there was a feeling, which exists today. I mean, you don't have to worry about reading the 60s. Just watch President Reagan on the television. You're seeing a rerun of the same thing. There is an assumption that the United States has the right to control a certain section of the world. And if poor people, often living under oppression, rise up to demand dignity in their lives, to make a revolution, if you like, which is, of course, how this country was founded, that by definition, those people are communists, and they're anti-American, and we must be opposed to them. Okay? The fear in Nicaragua is that if the Nicaraguan government is able to provide wealth for its people, there will be other revolutions in Guatemala and so among starving and hungry people. And what America's role is supposed to be is to put down those revolutions and to protect people like Ferdinand Marcos, because they're anti-communist, or Papa Doc Duvalier, whose country was starving to death while he ripped it off to the tune of hundreds of millions. But that's okay. That's okay. They're anti-communists. Somoza was a fine man. He was an anti-communist, and in 1973 we overthrew Salvador Allende because he was a socialist. And now we have a fascist government there that's killed 30,000 people. That's okay. They're anti-communist. But really, the truth of the matter is, to be honest with you, it hasn't changed. The reason I think basically that the United States was in Vietnam, the reason that the United States supported Chiang Kai-shek in China for many years is that you have, as Rick was indicating, we live under a capitalist system which is dominated by very wealthy and powerful corporations who see the underdeveloped world and the third world as a source of raw materials and as a source of cheap labor. And it's important that those people stay poor and stay dominated by wealthy forces. And if Vietnam overthrew its ruling class, this idea could spread. And it's exactly the same phenomenon as going on in Nicaragua. It really hasn't changed, and it's really not very complicated. You go through your history books, and you find out. I mean, I don't have to, that's for another subject. But, you go to the United States has been involved in dozens of countries in Latin America. Constantly, the Marines are down there as soon as the people begin to rise up and demand a better life. Country after country. And the countries remain poor, starvation exists, but so long as the government remains quote-unquote anti-communist, they're a friend of the United States. So I don't think Kennedy's assassination had too much to do with it. Yeah?
Do you think a large part of Reagan's appeal is his willingness to make the decisions for us that we wanted to make for ourselves in the 60s?
Boy, that's a tough question, and I don't know. What you're asking is, we went through a period in the 60s, and how do we end up today, and what is Reagan's appeal? And, it's a tough question. I really don't know the answer. I think one thing that I can say, I think with some certainty, is that while all of this movement was taking place, while kids, in a sense, were rebelling against their parents, it was a very frightening experience. People were losing control over their own kids. And you would have people clung for something that was traditional and conservative. Okay? It's when all kinds of crazy things are going on, you want something that you can hang your hat on. Okay, and Reagan is certainly giving the people of America something, it's the same line that has existed for 100 years. America is, we believe in freedom, we believe in God, the rest of the world is not really where it's at, and we have the right to do this. It's pretty simplistic stuff. And I think there's some of that appeal. But I think the phenomenon of Reaganism would be maybe too long for now. Okay.
Maybe at the end of the course. I have a sort of comment about that question, which is there's another level of analysis that you could look at it from. And that would be a more economic level of analysis. Okay, America came out of the Depression into a Second World War and fueled its economy on a war economy, constructed itself back up to a level where it functioned very well. Then people got very rich, fat, and comfortable, and had a chance to sit back and look at itself but it also invented one of the most terrible weapons at the same time. Okay, so then that cycle sort of went through. But in order to maintain that cycle of wealth, you had to go outside. You know, it could no longer be generated within the country. It had to go outside to look for cheap labor because the labor movement had become strong and the wages had gone up and so on. So I think it's very complicated. I don't think you could really say, why did we elect Reagan this time around? I mean, one could say that we were on another one of these crazy cycles. You know, you could also attribute it to Kennedy and the Democrats. I mean, there was this big baby boom coming along. If you look at the curve in the growth of the size of government from the Kennedy administration on, it goes like this, and then it goes like that. Right from the Kennedy administration, the size of the government goes almost straight line up. If it had continued to go up, we would have had more government than people. You know, if they, in 10 years at the rate of growth that it was going through. So there's another factor. What role did that play? I don't know. I think it's real complicated.
I think another factor that took place is, and I remember a very, very significant political event took place in 1968. And it didn't get much, I think if people who write the history books now wouldn't see it as significant, but I do. In 1968, a guy named George Wallace, who actually today is still governor of Alabama, who at that period was an admitted racist. That is, he won international recognition because he stood, as some of you may recall, at the door in the front of the University of Alabama when it was about to be integrated, and the president had sent down troops down there, and he was defying the federal government and so forth and so on. And he was admittedly a white supremacist. And in '68, he decided to run for president of the United States. And all the very politically sophisticated people said, well, this is a joke. I mean, here's you have this admitted racist, and certainly he'll probably get some votes among white Southerners, but once he gets out of the South, he's going to be laughed, you know, he's going to be laughed out of the ballpark. So he goes marching into Michigan for a Democratic primary. He's running a Democratic primary. And I think he lost the primary, I don't remember. He got an enormous amount of votes. And this was a very astounding phenomenon. People saying, I don't understand this. Here you have an admitted white racist running in a northern state, which was a liberal state or a moderate state, getting a tremendous amount of votes. What is going on? You see, that takes us to where we are today. And it was very shocking. Remember that, Rick? And then the word was out that there were a lot of white people, for example, who were not all that happy about the changes that were taking place in the civil rights movement. That, in fact, America was a lot more racist than people had thought. And, in fact, somewhere around that time, came a study done by, after, I guess, during the period of when Martin Luther King was killed, around that period, there was a study done on racism in the United States, done by Otto Kerner, I remember, the Kerner Commission it was called. And it really made the point that, in fact, racial feelings and racial hostility, racial prejudice, was a lot deeper than people had, the academics, if you like, had allowed themselves to believe. And I think what began to happen is, as this becomes apparent, then politicians, whether it's the Ronald Reagans or the Spiro Agnews, begin playing on that point, begin playing on the racism which was becoming quite apparent. So I guess one of the things, if you talk about the 60s, which I think is very important to understand the 80s, you understand the backlash. You know, we could talk about Janis Joplin and the Beatles and all these wonderful things and, you know, 500,000 young people coming together in Woodstock and da-da-da-da, fine. You got to talk about that. But that's not all that was happening. George Wallace is suddenly getting votes running a campaign of racism in the United States. How do the two go together? How does that relate to what's happening in the United States today? Okay, an important issue. So again, things don't only look at the young people doing all these wonderful things. There were other things going on in the country at that time. And in fact, I mean, taking your question a step further, maybe we can open this up. How do you go from the 60s to where you are in the 80s? What's the process? What are the important events? Questions or comments?